I want to welcome Dr. Monica Nowalska. She'll be the chair. Our speaker today will be Tatiana Barkovskiy. I just want to welcome you guys. I appreciate Tatiana's acceptance of my invitation to be the speaker today. We really look forward to having you here, your talk here. Please, Monica, the floor is yours.
Okay, hello, good afternoon or good evening, good morning, whatever time it's with you. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Tatiana, whom I met, although we both from Warsaw originally, whom I met first time in India, in Varanasi. We spent some hours rummaging through bookshops and then watching evening puja at the Ghat of Ganges. So Tatiana, she's at the moment, she's a PhD student for 1 year already, I think, in philosophy in University of Cambridge. And she's a young scholar, but she's already very accomplished. You can check all the things on her webpage, which I recommend you to look at. It's tatianabarkovskiy.wordpress.com. And so she is a PhD student. Her supervisor is Professor John Marenbon, and she's working on philosophical ideas of 13th century begins. But she did her MA and 2 BA in Warsaw. So it seems that for her scholarly life, she's interested in a mystical philosophy or philosophy of mysticism, and in female philosophers or philosophy of gender or feminist philosophy, because she did her BA in philosophy in University of Warsaw on maternal images of God in medieval philosophy and mysticism, and she did her BA in French studies on Marguerite Porete, a female voice within religious discourse. Last year, she finished her MA in University of Warsaw, supervised by Professor Magdalena Bieniak, and her dissertation was Begain, philosopher Marguerite Porete on epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. And she's already published a couple of articles in Polish noted philosophical periodicals, got a lot of grants, scholarships, awards, bursaries. She's really very accomplished, very talented, and doing very interesting stuff. So I think we really looking forward to listening to your talk, and the screen is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much for this absolutely lovely, very extremely generous introduction. And thank you, of course, to the organizers for inviting me to present at the webinar. I was invited to present on a topic of my choosing, and I'm very happy to talk to you today about one of my favorite medieval thinkers. Marguerite Porete famously burned at the stake for heresy in 1310 after extremely stubbornly refusing to recant her views, was a late medieval beguine. That is a woman who wore religious dress but did not declare any vows of obedience towards the ecclesiastical authority, nor renounce her private property. The only work that has been attributed to her is The Mirror of Simple and Annihilated Souls, written in a medieval French vernacular. It is a didactic dialogue between personifications of virtues and other abstract philosophical values, and importantly, all of its characters are presented as feminine. The character of the personified soul represents one of the most important figures in the mirror, meant to symbolize the soul of the reader and guide them through the didactic contents of the treatise, illustrated by her discourse with other personifications, mainly love and reason. The character of love stands as a porte-parole for the divine itself, and its powers are meant to mirror the traits of the divine, whilst reason is designed as a voice for Porete's scholastic contemporaries. the central idea of the mirror is that the human soul can pass through 7 different stages of love, after which it is carried out of its being, leaving behind not only its earthly material body, but also its entire spiritual self, so to speak, to be fully united with the divine, thus, as the treatise's title suggests, becoming simple and annihilated. Now, Porete defines the simple soul as a being that is saved by faith without works, is only in love, does nothing for God, leaves nothing to do for God, can be taught nothing, from whom nothing can be taken, to whom nothing can be given, and who possesses no will. This description sets out several moral and cognitive characteristics of such soul, such as that its salvation comes from pure faith and love rather than any external deeds and acts of piety. Its moral and volitional surrender to God are rooted in an acknowledgement that God's power is sufficient for its spiritual growth. Thus, it exists in a state of being beyond the need for any external teaching or guidance, with no personal desires or wants. In another passage of the Mirror, in her typically paradoxical way, Porete writes that if you understand perfectly your nothingness, you will do nothing, and this nothingness will give you everything. Now, this statement has, I believe, twofold significance. On the one hand, it illustrates Porete's idea of faith without works, which I just mentioned. And on the other, it also shows that the existential dread the soul might experience and endure, having understood its state, is indeed nothing, as this understanding will provide it with an overwhelming sense of comfort or everything, reminiscent of its pre-existent nothingness. And so, no longer attached to worldly possessions, personal desires, and any other self-centered pursuits, the soul will be completely focused on its union with the divine, which will grant it a state of profound inner peace and fulfillment. Now, combined, these two aspects call into question the extent to which Porete believed human beings to possess, or rather exercise, free will, and how it was informed by her idea of the soul's nothingness. And so, in my talk, I will focus on Porete's nuanced understanding of the soul's perfect ontological nothingness and imperfect less-than-nothingness, and show how they translate into her idea of the nothingness of the soul's will. Historians of philosophy are increasingly coming to recognize that philosophical discussions may reside within texts that are not immediately identified as such. Historians of medieval philosophy, more specifically, are beginning to see a compelling illustration of this phenomenon in the contributions of medieval beguines and other authors, usually referred to as medieval women mystics, such as Marguerite Porete. Porete's philosophical discourse, in fact, is even less so mystical than that of other beguines. Her treatise is a piece of non-visionary literature. This is extremely important. And she employs many syllogisms to substantiate her argument developed throughout it, hence the title of my talk. Although she also wishes to demonstrate the limits of language by taking it to its very extremes, something we see in the paradoxes produced by her discourse. In this way, she puts forward a very interesting mystical logic, if you will. Now, before I begin, let me clearly state that there will be no actual formal logic in my presentation, at least not today. Instead, I will explore the various relationships between different meanings presented by Porete, examining the tensions between being, nothingness, and less-than-nothingness. And so hopefully those interested in, for example, paraconsistent logics or dialaphism will find something valuable in it, hopefully. Now, Elsewhere, Porete calls the soul the lady of the virtues, daughter of deity, sister of wisdom, and bride of love, and even makes her proclaim, but I was and I am, and I always be without lack. For love has no beginning, no end, and no limit, and I am nothing except love. Though she also affirms that this seems to reason to be strange language. As Porete writes, God has transformed the soul into himself, so the soul must not forget its nothingness, namely what it was when God first created it. And so the soul's nothingness represents its pre-existent state of unity with the divine nature, which it can achieve again once it becomes fully simple and annihilated. In other words, the soul was nothing in its pre-existent mode of being, and it will become nothing again once it has fully accomplished its spiritual journey. As the character of love states, or of the soul states, I am freed from this labor, for my better thing is elsewhere, which is so far from this that one would not be able to compare it. The end of my better thing is in God, who is beyond time. But I possess time in order to attain what is mine from him, and what is mine is that I might be established in my nothingness. The soul's true destiny and high purpose lie elsewhere in the eternal realm of the divine, and are so vastly different from its current constitution in the material world that they cannot be compared to any other experiential thing. And now the soul is able to perceive this ontological chasm between the physical in the metaphysical, precisely because it is so bound to the realm of the former. Yet it is precisely by existing in constraints of time and earthly limitations that the soul is able to recognize the importance of properly utilizing its mortal time in the pursuit of its divine destiny, and thus allowed to achieve a higher purpose that transcends these limitations. It is precisely on the grounds of the irreconcilable ontological difference between the soul and the Godhead that much of the soul's earthly material existence is established. And again, it is also by the Godhead's grace that it is given this earthly existence, and the personified soul does not fail to acknowledge this. Called upon the character of the personified reason to describe herself, she declares, I am what I am by the grace of God. Therefore, I am only that which God is in me, and not some other thing. And God is the same thing that he is in me, for nothing is nothing. Thus he is who is. Therefore, I am not, if I am, except what God is, and nothing is beyond God. I do not find anything but God in whatever part I might find myself, for he is nothing except himself. And once again, as a reflection of the divine rather than something completely ontologically and epistemically separate from it, the soul can, by becoming simple, participate in the perfect and absolute nothingness that is inherently bound to the unchanging essence of divine nature. Highlighting the supremacy of this divine existence, Porete acknowledges the soul's being as contingent upon and inseparable from that of God, whom it experiences in every facet of its being as the ultimate truth and the only reality. Porete gives prominence to the timeless transcendence of the divine elsewhere, when she calls God he who is in himself and of himself without beginning. It is in this context when she speaks of the eternal effect of divine love on the soul. As the soul states, since he will never love, that is, eternally, anything without me, I say, therefore, that it follows that he never loved anything without me. In addition, since he will be in me through love forever, therefore I have been loved by him without beginning. And so, because divine love exists outside of any temporal constraints, and as such grants a continuous and unbroken connection to the soul has been loved by the divine without a beginning. So This is, of course, not to say that the soul has also existed for eternity, even if it were to be through the transcendent love of the Godhead, aware of stepping so close to heresy in order to protect herself from possible accusations of preaching pre-existence in its most pure and unorthodox form. Porete makes reason proclaim, "Watch what you say, Lady Soul. Have you forgotten that you have just barely been created and that once you were not?" To which the soul responds that if she is indeed mistaken in saying this, then love errs with her, who makes her believe and think and speak. Now, almost defeated by the reference to the absolutely highest authority, again, in the mirror, love represents the divine, reason commands the soul to prove what she says. And so the soul continues and does so in a language that is certainly philosophical and in its organized structure, almost scholastic. She says, "Ah, reason, if I am loved without end by the three persons of the Trinity, I have also been loved by them without beginning. For as he will love me without end through his goodness, thus have I been in the knowledge of his wisdom, so that I must be created by the work of his divine power. Thus, as long as God is, who is without beginning, I have been in the divine knowing that I might be without end." As the soul is loved endlessly by the Godhead, it logically follows that it has also been loved by it without a particular beginning, for the love of the divine is not bound by time and extends infinitely into the future and the past. Yet that which has always, that is, temporarily been loved by the divine, is not the soul itself, but rather the idea that God has always had of it in God's mind. Even if the soul's individual existence in God is intricately intertwined with the divine infinite wisdom, the otherwise imperfect existence was only brought about into the world by the creative power of that divine. The soul's perfect existence was, and again shall be, unconstrained by the limit of time, insofar as such soul is outside of the temporal world and survives only in the inherently faultless divine knowing, where it both has been and will be loved through the virtue of divine goodness. It is precisely these ideas of perfection, endlessness, and timelessness that are brought together by Porete in her concept of nothingness. Now, elsewhere, reason asks the soul if it is even proper to call nothing a thing which is of God, to which the soul replies that any and all gifts received from the divine would be nothing compared to one sole spark of God's goodness, which remains in his understanding beyond our understanding. Thus, this allegorical nothingness is to be understood as an infinitude of the potentiality of that which can come from the divine, which compared to the very nature of the divine is still infinitely small and seems to be, well, rather nothing than something of real significance or of real value. Later on, already confronted with her prior nothingness, the soul desperately asks, "Who am I, since I was no thing before I owed to God something through the work of my own will? And I would have to be no thing again if I had what this book says, before I would be acquitted of any of one of my defects, and not until. But now I have in myself neither what is described, nor anything else, nor can I have it. Ah, truth, who am I?" Now, the soul's conclusion that she would have to be nothing again ultimately affirms that once it is annihilated, it shall return to its perfect pre-existent state of nothingness. Interestingly, rather than being afraid of returning to her nothingness, the soul seems to be afraid of not, simply put, not getting there fast enough. I think that by writing her as a character in this way, Porete is setting an exemplum for the readers of the Mirror who, confronted with the annihilation which comes with the end of the mortality, might experience a sense of existential dread, even though, of course, the Bible clearly states that for you are dust and to dust you shall return. And even Porete herself declares elsewhere that whoever would wish the comforts of God through the feeling of consolation, the consolations would impede the enterprise of fine love. Yet it is only in this endmost state of the death of the individual self, and not a moment earlier, when a person can finally be acquitted of their defects. It appears that as an interlocutor in the treatise, even the soul herself has not yet accomplished this state, because, well, after all, she would not be able to participate in the discourse otherwise. Perhaps this is why, in her imperfect comprehension, the soul still does not exhaustively, completely understand her own nature. And so, summoned by her, truth explains. You were nothing as long as you had abandoned nothing of what I gave to you. Now you are another thing, for you are less than nothing by however many times you have willed something other than my will. Now, having undergone this transformation from unto the imperfect another thingness or somethingness separate from the divine, every time the soul strays from truth by using its will rather than the divine will of truth, it distances itself from its perfect nothingness, at which point it did not possess an independent existence, and becomes increasingly less than nothing. This state should not be understood literally, I think, as the soul's ontological condition, because after all, there can be no thing less than nothing, but axiologically, the soul's deviation from truth's will has simply diminished its spiritual value. Now, Porete seems to be employing two types of nothingness here. On the one hand, the ontologically perfect nothingness, in which the soul is able to take part as long as it adheres to what was given to it by truth. And on the other hand, the axiologically imperfect less than nothingness, brought about by its own individual will, which distances it from its inherent nature and purpose and results in a diminished state of being. Before that, the soul is temporal and imperfect because the divine is timeless and perfect. Is less than nothing because only once it becomes united with the divine can it delight in a pure nothingness. Now, according to Porete, both prior to its appearance in the temporal material world and once it overcomes its distractions and the limitations of its human body, the soul is a simple and pure entity capable of contemplating God without any intermediary. This contemplation is necessary for the soul to realize its ultimate ontological goal, namely to return to its original state of unity with the divine. In this way, the simple soul is placed in, as Porete calls it, being without being, which is capital B, being. In other words, it exists in a pure divine nothingness, which, unlike the worldly matter, represents the most perfect mode of existence. And so, simply put, divine being is so perfect that it can only be described as nothingness, as no created thing can be as perfect as the divine. Now, this point brings us to the Poretian concept of the soul willing nothing. In general, Porete explicitly and repeatedly affirms both the existence of free will and its status as a gift from God, granted to the soul as an inherent element of its essence and constituting a trait of the divine in its form. She writes, for instance, now the divine goodness has placed free will within the soul by pure divine goodness. Thus enclosed within the soul is free will from the being of God who is being, who wills that the one who has no being might have being according to such a gift from himself. Be it as it may, Porete also argues that the simple soul should nevertheless strive to reject its will. In one passage, she explores the interplay between such concepts as freedom, sensory experience, desire, and the will when she states, "Whoever serves, they are not free. Whoever senses, they have not died. Whoever desires, they will. Whoever wills, they beg. Whoever begs, they have a lack of divine sufficiency." Now, submission entailed by devoting oneself to serving one's external authorities or peers, and even one's own self, distances oneself from true freedom. It is only through a complete indifference towards worldly obligations and affections that full spiritual liberation can be obtained. This is why Porete compares the act of using one's will to begging. She perceives an essential dependence on something greater than the subject, even in the simple act of exercising one's will, as it is embedded in the inherently human experience of insufficiency and incompleteness that can be overcome only through achieving divine unity. This, of course, is a perspective that goes far beyond conventional notions of personal autonomy. Here, the act of returning one's will to its source signifies a conscious decision to align one's personal intentions and choices with the higher divine will. Arising from the recognition of the divine realm as the ultimate source of goodness and truth, it posits that the unrestrained, so to speak, exercise of individual will can lead to attachments, desires, and actions that are not in harmony with the spiritual domain and can even form obstacles to a deeper understanding of its nature. In itself, free will is, of course, not inherently evil, for how can it be, given its perfect divine origin, but it can be misused and misguided when disconnected from this origin, leading the soul to a focus on worldly matters rather than its spiritual growth. As an inherent and inalienable aspect of human nature, it should be employed in a way that recognizes its divine source. Thus, it should not be outright rejected, but instead reoriented towards a higher purpose, which is best achieved through its full and perfect alignment with the divine will, guiding it by divine knowledge and goodness. Importantly, Porete insists that even something that may appear to be as innocent or nomen omen godly as acting in the name of God represents a less ideal attitude than simply willing nothing. The reason for this lies in the irreconcilable ontological difference between the divine and the human, which renders all good works done in this mortal coil bland in comparison with the infinite goodness of the divine, and thus any exercise of the will, simply put, less ideal than a complete rejection of its active use. As Porete writes, "For as the work of God is more worthy than the work of a creature, so this willing nothing in God is more worthy than willing good for God's sake." The disparity between the two can be bridged only by relinquishing all use of the will whatsoever. As long as the soul wills nothing, it is alone in God without itself, completely unencumbered. Now, instead, the soul must will to will with the perfect will of the divine. And so the Poretian free aspect of free will comes from freeing oneself of one's self. It is precisely when a person begins to will something, thus partaking in the individuality rather than striving to become one with the divine, that they lose their freedom. Although the will is by its very nature free, when it is ruled by any subjective factors, it is not free. In essence, insofar as one is concerned with oneself, one is not free. As the soul says, "It is the goal of my work always to will nothing. For as long as I will nothing, I am alone in God without myself, completely unencumbered. And if I should will something, I am with myself, and therefore I have lost freeness. So according to Porete, that which philosophy has traditionally understood to be free will cannot in fact be free, as it is enslaved by subjective desires. A truly free person is the one who no longer wills anything on their own accord or in servitude to, well, themselves or any other persons, but instead chooses to become a vessel for the will of the divine. As Porete writes, thus the soul wills nothing, since it is free. For one is not free who wills something by the will within them, whatever they might will. For when one is a servant of oneself, one wills that God accomplish his will to one's own honor. The one who wills this only wills that the will of God be accomplished in them and in another. And so, as long as an individual is not yet truly liberated, they might wish for the divine will to be accomplished in them in a way that brings honor and benefit to themselves. Simply put, if it aligns with their own desires rather than the divine itself. As Porete holds, one must rise above such need for personal gain and the self-serving attitude of living in only partial, conditional surrender to the divine, and instead strive for a more selfless mode of being by, in a way, detaching from one's will. Importantly, simple souls still possess a faculty with which they will not to will, which can then be redirected at willing the divine will. In this context, Porete writes, whoever would ask such free souls if they would want to be in purgatory, or if they would want to be certain of their salvation in this life, or if they would want to be in paradise, they would say no. But then with what would they will it? They no longer possess any will, and if they would desire anything, they would separate themselves from love. For the one who possesses their will knows what is their good, and this is their sufficiency without them knowing it. Even though Porete clearly states that the simple souls no longer possess any will, it is clear that the soul's will cannot be filled with the divine will if there is no faculty to sort of take this higher will on. By willing nothing, the will indeed possesses nothing of its own, but does not itself become nothing. Although the nothingness of the will is indeed a term used by Porete, she seems to be referring rather to the nothingness of the objects of creation presented to and ordered by the will, and not the will itself. The will in itself, in its essence, is still an intentional faculty, that it can turn away from its natural intentionality, or rather redirect itself to a higher object. Instead of standing for a literal nothingness of one of the soul's essential faculties, the nothingness of will must be then, I'd argue, interpreted within the context of Porete's wider discourse on the metaphysical nothingness of that which is not worldly but divine, as well as our cognitive inaptitude to grasp it. She writes, and God is so great that the soul has fallen into certainty of knowing nothing, and into certainty of willing nothing, and this nothingness gives it the all. Moreover, the nothingness of the will, which must therefore be understood in the most positive terms, is something the soul loses when thrust into mortal existence. After the soul achieves its spiritual objective of being closely reunited with the divine, the nothingness of its will is still intentional, but already in the sense that the will does not have any object other than the most perfect divine. So this nothingness is simply meant to convey the soul's diminishing powers, voluntary powers, or more precisely, its lack of desiring something other than the divine. This is a state in which the soul's nothingness of will is intimately intertwined with the nothingness of its understanding. Porete writes, "Such ones live in freedom of charity who have no more will, and whoever would ask such souls what they want, in truth they would say that they want nothing. Such persons have arrived at the understanding of that nothingness, and that is where something created in them, they could understand nothing about their nothingness, for their understanding would be too small to understand such a loss." Now, to conclude, let me reiterate that for Porete, to live in genuine freedom means to exist with no regard for one's personal will or desires, but instead to be able to transcend one's wants in the name of wanting nothing, and thus achieve a higher level of spiritual understanding. Through this, a person can both humbly recognize, according to Porete, their insignificance in the face of the divine and imagine their pre-existent nothingness, where any experience of individual identity is not only overshadowed by the greater truth of divine presence, but also simply irrelevant. This can be achieved precisely by discarding all that is created within them, such as their attachments, longings, or fears, the presence of which renders a person's understanding insufficient to fully grasp the depth of their nothingness, by keeping them tethered to the material existence and thus unable to lose their feeling of self. By the growing practice of ethical detachment, starting with a sort of a breaking off from worldly desires through a disengagement with other people, and finally even a surrender of its individual self, the soul is able to focus all of its attention on the Godhead alone, and through this become simple and annihilated. It should be noted that the soul's awareness of its ontological makeup is extremely important. It's crucial for its salvation. This is why soul the character wishes to see herself always, if she is to see anything, where she was when God made all things from nothing, so that she might be certain that she is not other than this, when she is of herself. This means that when the soul is still of itself, in other words, when it constitutes a separate entity with an individual will and other cognitive powers necessary for pondering its being, that is, seeing itself, it desires to perceive that it came from a very specific ontological source, the Godhead, to which it shall return once it accomplishes all the stages of the mystical journey and becomes annihilated. This desire stems from its awareness that should it perceive otherwise, it would deviate from its divinely designated path and fail to become saved. If there is at least one thing that the soul must understand, it is precisely its ontological source by which it will be able to accomplish its ontological destiny. Now, as I have tried to show, the logic of being nothing and willing nothing in Porete's mystical framework refers to her radical redefinition of existence and freedom. By becoming nothing and relinquishing personal will, the soul aligns with a higher divine will, achieving true spiritual freedom and unity with the divine. This logic, while not formal, is deeply rooted in the coherence and consistency of her mystical reasoning. Now, much of this reasoning is defined by negations. For instance, the negations by which Porete defines the free soul serve to detach the soul from earthly and egoistic constraints so that it can achieve a state of pure unmediated existence with the divine. The logic here is thus seen in how these concepts interrelate to describe a state of being that is paradoxically defined by what the soul lacks, because the free soul is saved by faith without works, it is only in love, it is inactive, it is devoid of will. Being saved by faith without works, in turn, negates the active pursuit of salvation through deeds. There is also some dialectical logic, I think, that can be detected here, which of course involves the resolution of contradictions. So Porete's notion of the soul doing nothing for God, being taught nothing, and having no will seems contradictory to traditional religious teachings, which emphasize active faith and labor. But even such contradiction is eventually resolved by Porete in her mystical framework. This is because the negation of one's self and one's will leads to a union with the divine being and the divine will. And thus this dialectical, if you will, process described by Porete involves moving from the thesis of self-centered existence through the antithesis of the negation of self, and finally to the synthesis of a unified divine existence. Now, this finally brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention and for your patience. I look forward to your questions now.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yes, questions and comments. Okay, Melly.
I didn't actually mean to ask a question. Did you mean me?
Yes.
Sorry, no, I don't have a question. I was just trying to make my screen bigger. I'm sorry.
Okay, we have a question from Ruud.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Tatiana. Great talk, great topic. Love it. One question I have is personal, maybe. Is this now also your view? Do you agree with Marguerite, or is it just a topic of...
Right. If I did in fact agree with Porete, I would have turned down Assis' invitation to come to speak to you, because I would decide to live outside the society, to live with no attachments to people, and even in a way to myself. Although, of course, Porete herself, she also saw the importance of teaching people about this. And actually, when we look at her biography, as you hopefully still remember from the very beginning of my talk, she was burned at the stake for heresy by the Inquisition in Paris. And I also mentioned that she very stubbornly refused to recant her views, because they gave her many chances to do so. She was actually imprisoned for 2 years, and still she again extremely stubbornly refused to recant her views. So to an extent, she did believe in doing sort of public philosophy, in engaging with people. She was actually deemed heretical precisely because of her public activity. She actually sent her treatise to some scholastics of her time, so basically, literally, to the sort of philosophical establishment, if you will, of her time. And it was only when some bishops and other scholastics noticed that a woman was doing that, and that she was preaching non-existence and the departure from virtue and all of that, it's only then when they arrested her. And what I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, she, again, did believe in doing public philosophy, but on the other, there was a moment when she finally decided to sort of live what she preached. And this is why I think that she willfully, if you pardon the pun, embraced the fires of the Inquisition, basically because she wanted to be reunited with God as soon as possible. So perhaps when I'm her age, when I'm a bit older, I believe she was 60 when she died, quite tragically. Perhaps when I'm older, I will I will do that, but not now. I believe I still have some philosophical work to do.
Thank you. And we have two more questions. First Cecilia and then Bill. Okay.
Hi, Tatiana. Thank you so much for your presentation. You did a beautiful job. If I understand correctly what you were trying to do, it was trying to like give a philosophical interpretation of kind of like a poetic version of poetry, which I absolutely love. So my question is kind of like, okay, I have some philosophical commitments that seem contradictory to what she's saying. And then I have a question about your particular interpretation to see if it really is contradictory. Because as I see, you're trying to like explain her philosophy in a more rigorous way. So basically, the biggest hang up I have with her presentation is what it means to be unified with God, because this seems like a commitment of any Christian that we're going to be unified with God. And when I think of unity here, it has to be a unity of two things put together. Unity can't erase the parts that are together, because otherwise it just becomes a simple thing and not a unified thing. There's no more unity if there isn't parts to be unified. So she talks about getting rid of like your will for other things which are contrary to unity with God. But then your understanding of her nothingness seems to be like still a presence of a second order or higher order will. And I'm just wondering, like, if she really does mean, based off of your scholarship and research, does she really mean that you would abandon your second order will? Like it's not that you would be willing nothing, but there wouldn't be a will, because you talked about a faculty of a will. And I was like, okay, so maybe there is a will still there. I don't know if that question makes sense, but I'm just wondering, is the second order will, is that actually gone on her view?
Right. So I see at least two questions here. First, the idea of being united with God is, of course, an unorthodox one. It's extremely entrenched in Christian dogma. The question is, how exactly does a person sort of get there? And again, the sort of heretical bit of Porete's attitude, of her answer to that question, was that a person has to relinquish all relations to other people. She also explicitly, in several passages, she says that even the Bible itself does not sort of give a full picture of the divine truth, basically. So when it comes to historical documentation of the inquisitorial process against her, we know that there were, if I remember correctly, 16 or 17 or 18 articles against her. We only have two. One was about virtue, and the other, I think it was precisely about will. So perhaps, there was more that the Inquisition saw in her that really, struck a nerve there. So again, the idea of being one with God is extremely Christian. It is nothing. It is nothing that would be sort of novel even for a Christian thinker, but it is the way she describes the soul achieving this unity. So, and to answer your second question, when it comes to the unity, of course, there is like unity it's something that can only be achieved by two people, two beings, sort of two essences even. And this is precisely why I think, because this is, well, I would say that this is still a bit disputed in sort of the Poretian scholarship, but there isn't actually much in the way of philosophical, purely philosophical, not theological, philological, historical scholarship when it comes to her. So it's not really disputed, but there are some different perspectives as to what exactly is lost, what exactly is rendered nothing in the uttermost last stages of the 7 stages of the soul, as I mentioned in the beginning. And because sort of because of my desire to keep Porete's philosophical thought as cohesive, as coherent as possible, and sort of limit the amount of paradoxes, or at least try to solve some apparent paradoxes that can be seen in her discourse. This is precisely the reason why I myself argue that there is still a faculty that takes this higher will on, because again, well, I mean, of course, in this larger process, the soul can first will to will the divine will, and then it's only then when the actual will is sort of dissolved, basically. But there is still this faculty through which, sort of upon which, the soul makes this still conscious, willing, if you will, decision to not to sort of give away its will completely, but rather to have it filled with the divine will rather than its own personal will. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, okay. So Bill is waiting.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have to go very soon. So I was going to ask 2 questions, and I probably won't have time to hear what you have to say. So I want you to say more about her project, and the project has to be in quotes. So it seems to be an aiming without aiming, and so I sort of see this as something like what it's like trying to fall asleep. As long as you're trying, you can't fall asleep. And so the question I have is, that's part of the question. But the second part of the question is that since she can't actually aim towards God, because there's no object there to be known, there's nothing, God is a nothing for her. So she seems to be sort of presuming that in her emptying herself, and becoming nothing, that somehow or other she's approaching this dark object, which is the nothingness of God. So there's an immense faith that goes on here, and that she actually thinks this is what unification looks like. But she may not be sure, she can't be sure of that, because God himself is totally dark. And so anyway, I've got to go, but I'm really interested in hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Right. So, well, basically, again, several questions here to try and answer some of them as quickly as I can. I would think that the nothingness of the divine is actually, I think that Bill has gone, never mind. Well, I would say that, again, the nothingness of the divine is only nominal, of course. There's nothing, it's not as if Porete is trying to sort of become united with this total abyss of the darkness. It's just that she understands that because of the limits of language, one cannot really, even when using positive theology, one cannot really try and explain the mystery, the sort of infinitude of the divine by anything, basically, as in by anything. Hence, I think her use of the term of nothingness, and also I think that this quite neatly explains why she writes of the less-than-nothingness. And of course, this is my term, but it's a contraction now. In this sense, it is my term, but she does in several passages say that the soul is less than nothing. So I think that this nothingness, which is only nominal, it also explains why she believed the soul, insofar as it is active in the material world, to be less than nothing, because it is less than this sort of undefinable mystery of the divine essence, and so on. Yeah, Bill is not here to let me know whether I answered his question to satisfactory.
But I think Ruth has some comment there.
Yes, maybe also regarding Bill's question, by the way. I heard a couple of times that Porete said that she was that I am, or I am what I am, all of which go with the Hebrew echye asher echye. And of course that directly then refers to God. So then you might say that there is not really a unity. The so-called divine unity is apotheosis or henosis.
Well,
Just
yes, this of course. Sorry, go on.
It seemed like you suffered from a misunderstanding. You did not realize you were God while you were God all the time. And same with the will. You thought you had your own will and that it was free. But can you really will what you will without willing it already? So it turns out that your will has always already been God's will. And the only thing is to overcome this little misunderstanding that you thought it was yours. So this was just a comment to Bill, but I suppose you want to react to that, Tatiana.
Just a very brief ad vocem. I think I'd be quite inclined to agree with you. I think it's a very interesting interpretation because, of course, in the Bible, you have this passage, can't remember which, I think it's actually the Old Testament, so also the Hebrew Bible, which says that God is love. And Porete is, of course, well aware of this passage as an extremely well-educated woman, possibly coming from an affluent family, which is precisely the thing that allowed her to go about and learn and teach philosophy. Well aware of how important that little passage, that God is love, was important for earlier thinkers, and is still quite important to Christian thinkers today, I believe. She explicitly makes the soul, the character, proclaim that that I am love. I don't think she ever explicitly, in sort of a single passage has this triad of God, soul, love, as in she doesn't explicitly say I am, she doesn't explicitly portray the soul saying I am love and love is God, therefore I am God, because that's, I think, would have been a bit too much even for her, but there's definitely something in there.
Okay, thank you. The question I had was really if you could recommend a translation, perhaps a side-by-side translation.
There isn't, unfortunately, a side-by-side translation. There are, well, I imagine you're asking about an English translation and not like a modern French one. In English, there are, to my knowledge, two translations, one from 1993, the other from 1999. I believe the one from 1993 is, well, I can actually show it to you. Wait a second. So the older one is this one. It forms a part of the Polish Press Classics of Spiritually. It's a very neat book, I think. And I actually prefer it only because I prefer to use it in my writing, basically only because it's a part of this larger established series. For example, I also have Hadewig of Antwerp from this very first series, and Mechthild of Magdeburg to other 13th century begins. But I actually would, if you don't want to be confined as I myself am by sort of trying to have many books from a single series, from a single editor, I would much more sort of ardently recommend the other translation from 1999. I think it was published by the University of Notre Dame Press or Pennsylvania Press, definitely a publisher in America. And I think that edition is a bit better because, first of all, it has actual footnotes and not end of text notes, which I much prefer. And I also think that the authors of that translation, of whom there are 3, whereas this book is translated by Ellen Babinski, just a single author, translator, I think that they do a bit of a better job at like actually critically engaging with the text. So the footnotes alone are extremely interesting. It's very easy to Google.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions or comments? We have still some time, yes, Assis?
It's up to you. And the audience as well, of course.
So I don't know, Tatiana, would you like to say something more to us?
I don't know. I feel like I've already taken up quite a lot of your time. I can thank you again for the patience and your attention and your lovely questions. I really enjoyed them. And of course, they achieved what every good question at a conference or a webinar has to achieve, as in they've given me quite a lot to think about still about my research. So thank you again for that inspiration.
Yeah, we thank you. It was very fascinating. And it sounds very Indian from time to time, I must say so.
Oh, extremely so. I mean, it's, well, the idea of sort of relinquishing one's labor, oneself, one's will is quite sort of, it definitely brings up sort of, well, associations with several Asian philosophies, not only Indian, but also Taoism, Buddhist philosophies, and so on. And because of that, I suppose that you can't really say that Poret's philosophical thought is as novel as perhaps you would want it to be, if you, like myself, are sort of trying to put more hitherto ignored thinkers into the canon, especially medieval women, so as to combat this, presupposition that sort of, posits the Middle Ages as the time of the greatest intellectual oppression of women, which of course it was to an extent, but not as much as people think. So I would say that even though Poret's thought is not as novel when compared to other thinkers, I think that there's still some extremely important value in studying her, even in juxtaposition to other ideas which are similar to her own, because, well, on the one hand, they can also make us better understand both ideas or both thinkers who we sort of, bring bring together and, well, bring out the sort of intricacies of the thought. But often in the history of philosophy, it is extremely important to show that specific groups of people held specific ideas. So again, I work on women philosophers in the Middle Ages, and what I'm trying to show that, well, if I can prove that this particular author, for example, a Begin or a nun, whatever, she had this idea, this has very interesting implications to our current knowledge about resources that were available to women of the time, the sort of philosophical discussions between, say, that woman and other thinkers of her time. So it's really important, I think, to show such ideas, even if they are, again, not novel, simply to sort of emphasize the importance of hitherto ignored, philosophically ignored groups of thinkers in having such thoughts and ideas.
I think Cecilia wants to say something.
Yeah, thank you for that last point. I have a question on your presentation from earlier that I was still thinking about. And I don't know how interested you are in like examining the philosophy that you're trying to pull out of, I might call the poetry, or like the spiritual things. But when you're talking about this will that has nothing, I'm working under Eleanor Stump at St. Louis University, who's a philosopher there, and she argues for this idea of the difference between a will that's surrendering to God and a will that's submitting to God. And she says a submissive will is a will that basically is a race. It's saying, I will whatever God wills, and I'm not actually willing anything. Like I will what he wills, but as a servant, and then I get wiped out as an agent. Whereas her idea of a will that surrenders is a will that acts in love and says, okay, I will what God wills. But I mean, I wrestle with this idea that she's presented, but she's tried to argue for a distinction, these different types of not willing for myself, not having the selfish will, but willing what God wills. So if that's at all of interest to you, you might want to look at it, because it might help to interpret what this work a little bit more if you want. So.
I am well aware of Sam's research on this. Actually, I think I actually heard one of her papers live about it. Well, I think that Porete would actually argue that, or I could actually argue that for Porete it is the latter, the former. Sorry. So it's sort of a full giving away of the will. Simply because he has this, she also has this idea of the annihilation of the soul. So there is again something at the very end, and I can actually very, very quickly try to find it, because as I mentioned at the very beginning, she has this idea of the 7 stages of the soul, right? And she extremely elaborately describes every single stage, apart from the 7th one. When it comes to the 7th one, she only gives one sentence. The 7th stage, love keeps within herself in order to give it to us in eternal glory, of which we will have no understanding until our soul has left our body. So I think that this really emphasizes her idea of the annihilation, be it an annihilation of the body as in basically the sort of death, like the natural, be it natural or voluntary death of the body, death of the human person, or something a bit more mystical, that I don't know, could bring association with Bernini's statue of the ecstasies of Teresa de Avila, for example, something much more ecstatical and mystical. I myself struggle with this. I couldn't really answer the question of where exactly, of when exactly does Porete believe embodiment to stop within these 7 stages. I would be a bit more inclined to say, but again, only slightly so, more inclined to say that it is with the death of the body and not a mystical rapture, nothing like that. It's something much more natural, but don't quote me on it. I'm still not sure.
We have some comments from Ruth on chat, so you can have a look. And meantime, Ella wants to say something.
Yes, hi. Thank you, first of all, Tatiana. That was very enriching. I'm very glad I received this link in the last moment. I'm also working on Angelo Foligno, the same topics I even have here on my desk. Annihilation and authorship. It's a study about the 3 of them, Marguerite Porete and Angelo Foligno and Martin of Martin, so it can be helpful maybe. I was wondering if any of your publications were in English, because I would really love to read it and work with it in my own thesis. So.
Right, let me tell you, do keep in touch. I think I can actually write it in the chat now, my email. So I have several publications currently in the works or in review. I'm not a very diligent PhD student. As you can see, I'm trying to do everything I can instead of writing my actual thesis, just working on little side projects, unfortunately. Don't tell my supervisor. But please feel free, not just you, Ella, but whoever would want to, please feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to share some of my papers with you. Well, in English, I currently have two actually, which are finished. One is about the ontologically / metaphysically and epistemically transformative powers of love in Porete, and the other is about the nothingness of the world, basically. So it's sort of a larger discussion, which I put as sort of the second part of my presentation here, but in the paper it's much larger. It's like 10,000 words or so, so like 23 pages. So obviously much more elaborate, and I will be very happy to share it to you. I'm also working currently on something which will be in French, if you'd also be keen to read that.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, so just write to me, and yeah, I'd be
Okay.
happy to share it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We have Tatiana's website, so you
Thank
can
you,
go
Assis.
there, learn about her accomplishments. Any comments still, or questions, or reflections?
So I see that Ruth wrote
Yeah.
something about Julian of Norwich, but I think that this is just like an individual message that only I can see. So you just wrote Julian of Norwich ? So could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
I think she's also around the same time a female writer on
So,
similar topic. So
well, she's actually a bit later. She was born 63 years after the death of Porete. So, well, I understand for a medievalist, for a non-medievalist, this can be very, very close to time. For me, it's a bit later. But actually, Cambridge, my current university, is quite close to Norwich. So I've been meaning to take a little sort of pilgrimage to the reconstruction. Unfortunately, it's not the actual cell in which she spent, gosh, I don't know, 30 or 40 years of her life or so. But I do want to go there. Well, I'd say that Julian Norwich is a bit less philosophical and much more theological, because she, of course, does have many extremely interesting ideas, but they are more about the divine, basically, the mystery of the divine, as opposed to the changes the soul must experience in order to get closer to the divine. And like the latter, I think so, like the change within the soul is something that the idea of it is much more prominent in the 13th century Beguine thinkers.
So you think the soul can change? It's not just the human being, the person, but the soul.
Yes, exactly. It's, yeah, throughout my talk, I think it was, I tried to emphasize that it is precisely the soul that changes. And also, well, of course, it is still quite embodied, but it doesn't partake in its embodied constitution as much as another person would. So in a way, she's much more contemplative. She has sort of lost her will to participate in vita activa, and instead she has taken up this vita contemplativa, but a much more sort of hardcore, if you will, extent still.
Okay. Any more comments? So thank you very much. It was great and a nice discussion. And yeah, thank you. And I think Assis wanted to announce something.
Yes, I just want to end the session. First of all, thank you again, Tatiana, for this lovely presentation, as well as all the audience for the nice and stimulating discussion. Thank you so much. We'll have our next webinar. It will take place on July 25. The speaker will be a friend of mine, Martin Grassi. He's actually an Argentinian philosopher, but he's now in Italy. He will be talking about the concept of pneuma in Christian political theology and metaphysics. Okay, so see you in a month, and thank you so much for being here. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you.